BlackMagic's Fusion is very similar in design and function to the Foundry's Nuke, but there are enough differences that you'll get stumped if you don't know where to find your favorite tools. In this quick transition guide, we'll give Nuke artists an easy transition to working inside Fusion, so you can be up and using your hard-earned compositing skills in the land of BlackMagic within minutes rather than days. We're going to focus on only the built-in tools. There are plenty of additional plugins and macros out there to give you identical or similar behavior to Nuke's nodes, but we want to get you up and comping without the need to depend on plugins that may not be installed on every Fusion system. Let's start with the boring stuff, Preferences. Open the Preferences pane and you'll see at least two separate sets of preferences. The global and default settings are the main preferences, but anytime you create a new project, it inherits what changes you've made in the global and default settings and creates a new set of preferences just for that project. This can be a source of confusion, so it's important to understand that if you're making changes to the settings in the global and default settings, for the most part, they won't have any impact on an existing project. They'll only affect any new projects you create from then on. Okay, with that out of the way, let's look at the most important preferences to pay attention to. We'll work with the global settings here so that any future projects we create will inherit our settings. First is the frame format, where you'll set your composition's width, height, aspect ratio, and frame rate. Then comes color depth. Now, Nuke converts everything to 32-bit float upon import, but Fusion gives you the option to work in 8 or 16-bit integer or 16 or 32-bit float. In this day and age, there's no real reason to sacrifice quality for the sake of memory space, so you can pretty much ignore the integer options. But you can set full render to 32-bit float. You'll need to deselect lock depth first, or it'll change all three options at once, and leave preview and interactive set to 16-bit float for more efficiency while working. If the 16-bit becomes an issue when previewing certain shots, you can override these settings using the radio buttons in the Import tab of your source footage nodes. More in the Import tab later. Then in the Loader section, the Fusion name for a read node, set the loader depth to default so that it always uses the settings you just set in the Frame Format tab. There are a host of other options, and it's a good idea to take some spare time with the user manual to discover what they're all for. But we're focused on making you feel at home coming from Nuke, so let's just change a couple more preferences. In the flow settings, make sure Source Tile Pictures is checked to get a postage stamp on image source nodes. Another one here is Build Direction. The default behavior in Fusion is to build trees left to right. Coming from Nuke, you're probably more used to building your comps top-down, so choose Vertical. Finally, Nuke artists are used to being fairly lazy with how close their mouse is to an input or output before it selects. The default behavior in Fusion is that you need to have your mouse pointer directly over an input or output to be able to drag a pipe to or from it. Change the link distance to something more like 9 or 10 pixels, and you'll save yourself a world of frustration when noodling in the node graph area. A final import option that every artist should select, not just Nuke artists, is in the User Interface section. Be sure to select Use Gray Background Interface. The default Fusion interface is slightly blue, which could be problematic for color correction decisions. Selecting this will set it to a neutral gray. Now you'll need to quit and relaunch Fusion for the changes to take effect. Save your preferences, and let's move on to the rest of the application. Okay, let's take a look at importing footage and color management. Nuke tends to handle all of this fairly automatically. There's a little tweaking to be done in Fusion before we can start compositing. There are several ways to import media into Fusion. You can simply drag from the desktop, or you can manually add a loader node. Instead of the Tab key you're used to in Nuke, press Shift-Space to bring up the node picker. A nice enhancement from Nuke here is that you can type any part of the node name, not just the first few letters. We'll type Loader and select a loader node. As mentioned before, this is Fusion's read node. The most important tabs worth mentioning here are the Import and Format tabs. Let's start with Import. Here you can override the color depth settings we created in the preferences if needed, but what we really care about right now are the color space settings. Nuke reads the metadata attached to imported files and automatically attempts to remove the image's LUT, converting it to a linear color space. With Fusion, you need to specifically enable the Remove Curve option to do the same thing. If Fusion guesses the curve type incorrectly, you can explicitly set it by choosing either Space or Log and selecting the correct LUT from the list. Now, if you look in the viewer, things will probably look worse once you've done this. That's because out of the box, Nuke applies an sRGB LUT to your viewer to cancel out the gamma bias of the monitor. Fusion does not. So the second step is to click to enable the viewer LUT, then the menu arrow to the right of the LUT button, make sure Fusion View LUT is selected, and choose Edit. Set the color gamma to 2.2 to match sRGB, and close the settings pane. Now your color management should be operating the way you're used to in Nuke. The LUT is removed at the loader node, you work in linear float space, and the viewer applies an sRGB LUT so that things look right in the viewer while you work. The Format tab has settings specific to the kind of file you've imported. Of note is the way EXR files are treated. While Fusion doesn't internally support arbitrary names for EXR channels, you can map any AOVs that might exist on the incoming file to any of the Fusion native channels, essentially shuffling them in. Let's quickly call out different portions of the interface. All up, it's very similar to Nuke, with the exception that it defaults to 2 viewers. Otherwise, you have your Properties pane, the Node View, Spline Editor, and the Timeline, which, with the twirl of a triangle, gives you your dope sheet. There's also a handy console where you can read error messages and quickly enter Python or Lua commands. Fusion's extremely extensible with Python, Lua, and OpenCL accelerated fuses, similar to Nuke's Blink scripting. The interface is fully customizable. You'll find options in the right-click menus to undock views or add to them. Then save your custom layouts via the window menu. Unlike Nuke with its 10 buffers per viewer, Fusion sticks with 2. To switch buffers in a viewer, click the alternate buffer button, either A or B, and then press 1 to load the selected node into viewer 1. Press 2 to load into viewer 2, etc. Once you have both buffers filled, click on the viewer to set focus, and then press the comma and period keys to toggle between the buffers. A nice addition when working with a pen and tablet is the ability to flick images into the viewers instead of pressing the number key corresponding to that viewer. Navigation keys are reasonably similar to Nuke. Middle mouse drag to pan, or left and middle mouse buttons together to interactively zoom. To zoom with the scroll wheel, you'll need to hold down the Control key on a PC or Command on the Mac. If you click in a view to give it focus, the plus and minus keys zoom as they do in Nuke. Pen and tablet controls are identical to the Nuke style as well. Control or Command F is equivalent to pressing H to fit in Nuke, and like Nuke, pressing Control or Command 1 will set you back to 100% zoom. Okay, quickly touring the viewer buttons. The subview allows you to choose from a handy variety of overlaid scopes. You can scale the corner and right-click for options like parade scope viewing. Press V to toggle the subview on and off. Next we have the manual zoom buttons. Then buttons for quick access to adding roto and paint tools. The AB buffer load and compare buttons. Stereoscopic viewing options. A handy tool for snapping to pixel boundaries or centers. The RGBA channel view controls with the same hotkeys as Nuke. VR viewing options. The region of interest button. A toggle showing the current domain of definition. A button to lock the current node to the current viewer buffer. The hide viewer overlays button, equivalent to pressing Q in Nuke. A button to enable or disable the transparency checkerboarding. Most likely you'll want to disable that to match Nuke's display style. A toggle to smoothly resize pixels when zoomed in or display strict rectangular boundaries. A button to toggle aspect ratio correction. A button to quickly normalize the contrast range. And because we know you are missing them, quick access to the gain and gamma controls you're used to seeing at the top of your Nuke viewer. In Fusion, to set sliders back to their defaults, just click the small white dot that appears below the slider. And the Properties tab is pretty self-explanatory. However, unlike Nuke, only the currently selected node's properties are displayed. Don't panic. If you want more than one Properties tab open, click the Pin button to keep the current Properties tab open when you switch to a different node. Pin as many nodes as you like. Alright, let's get to noodling. When you add a node like Merge in Nuke, an existing selected node automatically connects to the foreground input. But in Fusion, it's the reverse. Selected nodes connect to the background input. In fact, an important UI philosophy in Fusion is that the background input is the primary one. When in doubt, connect to the background input. Here we'll add a blur node. As before, press Shift-Space to bring up the tool picker and start typing. To browse nodes the way you would in Nuke, right-click and select from the various Add Tools submenus. To disconnect a pipe, simply double-click. Drag from Input or Output to create a connecting pipe. Now, one thing that can be confusing coming from Nuke is that a node's inputs and output will move around the node to accommodate the repositioning of pipe connections. In Fusion, it's the color of the input that matters, not its location. Yellow input is the main background input, the pale green is the foreground, the light blue connector indicates a mask input, and the red square is the output. Now, don't worry if you get confused. An easy way to make sure you choose the correct connection is to drag a pipe over a node and then hold down the Alt or Option key before releasing the mouse. This brings up a menu of inputs to choose from. A nice shortcut for merging two nodes is to connect the output of one to the output of another. Fusion will automatically connect them via a newly created merge node. If you get your inputs crossed, Control or Command-T will flip the inputs for you. Unfortunately, there's no holding down Shift to branch in the current version of Fusion. You'll need to click in the gray space of the node view to deselect, add the new node, then wire it up. Oh, and to connect and extract nodes, hold down the Shift key and drag into or out of a pipe connection. Quick side note here, bypass is Control or Command-P, presumably for pause, instead of Nuke's D hotkey. You may notice as you're adjusting sliders and nodes that things go fuzzy in the viewer. That's Fusion's interactive proxy system at work. Now, if you're chugging through some 8K shots, you may need that, but much of the time it's unnecessary. To disable it and maintain full resolution during adjustments, click here. Also in here is the Update button, similar to Nuke's Viewer Update Pause, and a High Q button that, when disabled, will deactivate expensive processes like anti-aliasing, allowing you to work faster at the expense of final image quality. Obviously, you'll want to enable this to review the final shot. Now that we've taken care of the most important bits of getting around in Fusion, let's get down to finding out where your favorite nodes are. Probably the most important node in any app is the Merge node. The Merge node in Fusion is similar to Nuke's, with a few distinctions. First, for convenience, a basic transform is built into the Merge. Of course, you're free to add a transform node to the foreground input instead, but it's there if you need it. In Fusion's Merge, the blend modes are split between the Apply Mode menu and an additional Operator menu. The Operator menu options are available when the Apply Mode menu is set to normal. You'll find your inside and outside operations here. If you're looking for the Mix slider, it's available in the main tab of the Merge node as Blend. But for all nodes, not just the Merge, it's also here in this Atomic tab. This tab is common to all the nodes. Now, if you're missing some of the more mathematical blend modes like XOR or Subtract, you'll actually find them in the Channel Booleans node. Be careful when adding channel booleans. There are actually two nodes here, Channel Boolean and Channel Booleans. The former is a 3D texture node. The one we want for standard compositing is the latter, Channel Booleans. This is a cross between a shuffle node, a shuffle copy node, and the extended blend mode functions of the Nuke merge node. Now, there are many ways to combine mattes with images, and we're not going to cover them all here. But a common process in Nuke is to shuffle copy an alpha into an image, then apply a pre-multiply node immediately afterwards. The same process in Fusion can be done with a matte control node. Add the matte control, set the matte combine option to combine alpha, and then check post multiply image. Despite the strange name, this actually pre-multiplies the image. The post in the name simply refers to the fact that this happens at the end of anything else you might be doing in the matte control. The matte control node actually includes a host of other features for modifying matte edges. For the bare bones pre-mult and unpre-mult nodes, Fusion has the appropriately named alpha multiply and alpha divide. Another area of confusion for Nuke artists is the use of the polygon node, Fusion's roto tool. Working with polygon nodes in the mask input of, say, a color corrector works as expected. But try feeding the polygon node directly into a merge as an inside or an outside matte, and the result isn't what you're expecting. That's because Fusion's mask tools are created on a unique matte channel that's actually separate from the regular RGBA channels. A simple workaround for artists used to Nuke is to add a background node, the Fusion equivalent of a constant node, directly after the polygon node. Set the color to white, and you now have a matte living on the red, green, blue, and alpha channels. Everything will now behave exactly the way you're used to in Nuke. Also, be careful to pay attention to which input a polygon node is using to connect. By default, it will connect to a node's mask input, when a Nuke artist would expect it to connect to the main input of a node, so be prepared to rewire accordingly. Let's quickly run through a few other nodes. For color correction, use the Color Correct node. For reformat, use Resize. Hue Correct becomes Hue Curves. A backdrop is an underlay. While there's no strict match for the clamp tool, to quickly clamp whites and blacks, just use the Brightness Contrast node. For a frame hold, add a Time Stretcher node, right-click the source time label, and choose Remove Time Stretcher 1 Source Time. That'll remove the default curve and allow you to enter the number of the frame you want to hold. In the keying department, the Delta keyer will give Keylight a run for its money, and the Clean Plate is a modern-day IBK color tool. Corner Pin is actually two tools, Corner Positioner and Perspective Positioner, one for match moving, the other for stabilization. This is one area where you may want to consider extending functionality using third-party tools. There's an excellent suite of tools called CrocoDove that adds flexibility to the corner pin system in Fusion. At the time we recorded this video, CrocoDove was completely free to download. And as the loader is to the read node, so the saver is to the write node. Most of the other common nodes have the same name in both apps: Transform, OCIO, Sticky Note, Dilator Road, Primat, so on. Of course, there's a whole world of 3D and particles to get into, and you'll pretty much find parity of features between Nuke and Fusion here, with each package specializing in certain areas. But for typical comp work, projection mapping and the like, the workflows are extremely similar. So by now you should have a decent grasp of how to make the transition from Nuke to Fusion. Of course, there are a whole set of features in Fusion that simply aren't available in Nuke. In general, Fusion's motion graphics toolset is a strong point and essentially absent from Nuke. Another example is Fusion's text tool, which gives you atomic control of just about every aspect of a title, complete with individual character kerning, something essential for title work. We do feel the need to mention a couple of cool UI features before wrapping. Firstly, by clicking these buttons at the top of nodes, you can create 6 different variations of settings and toggle between them at will. This is obviously great for color grading looks, but can be used for all kinds of different effect settings. Another nice feature is default saving. Do you almost always want to combine the alpha channel when you add a Mac control node? Well, make the change once, right-click the node and choose Settings, Save Default. Now those settings will be there every time you create a new Mac control. This is also a great way to replace nodes that you're missing from Nuke. As an example, you may be frustrated at first by the lack of an invert node. You can add the channel booleans node and switch the mode to negative, but that gets a little tiresome. Instead, we'll save the setting, but this time we'll save it under the name invert instead of default. We can now access it via the settings menu whenever we need to recall it. And we can do one better. Just move it into Fusion's macros directory, and now it's searchable just like any other node and ready to add. And that's a wrap. We'll leave you to discover the rest. Oh, and of course, when you're all done, click the Render button to render out your hard-won shots.